November 14th, 1944. Grafenwoehr Proving Ground, Bavaria. A team of 30 German engineers gathered around a heavily guarded American tank, the M4A3E8 Sherman, freshly captured during the autumn offensive in France. The vehicle sat motionless on the test grounds, its modest silhouette a stark contrast to German expectations. The Wehrmacht had sent their best technical minds to this facility: suspension specialists, transmission experts, and senior engineers from Daimler-Benz and MAN companies that had built the Panthers and Tigers that allegedly dominated every battlefield they touched. Within 2 weeks of systematic testing, the German engineers would produce a report that contradicted everything they had publicly claimed about American tank design. Their conclusion would shake the confidence of the German High Command at the precise moment Germany could least afford doubt. The American M4A3E8 Sherman's HVSS suspension system possessed engineering advantages that the Germans had not anticipated, could not replicate, and would spend the remainder of the war trying unsuccessfully to overcome. Their own suspension designs, celebrated as technical marvels, were inferior to what they had dismissed as crude American pragmatism. This was not supposed to happen. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Oberführer Klaus Hartmann was 62 years old when he received the order to report to Grafenwoehr. A career engineer with 30 years of experience in German automotive and military vehicle design, Hartmann represented the institutional memory of the Wehrmacht's technical establishment. He had worked on predecessors to the Tiger tank. He had contributed to Panzer IV refinements. He carried the authority of a man who had shaped the mechanical weapons that Germany believed would dominate the 20th century. The order came from Berlin with unmistakable urgency. A Sherman tank, specifically a late-model M4A3E8 variant, had been captured intact near Mulhausen in Alsace. Its condition was remarkable. Operational damage was minimal, the engine ran, the transmission functioned, and most importantly, the suspension system was undamaged. The Germans wanted answers about American design philosophy before the tank could be sent for deeper technical analysis in Berlin. Grafenwoehr, as the Wehrmacht's primary vehicle testing facility, received the assignment. Hartmann arrived on November 11th, 3 days before the main testing team assembled. He spent those days in solitary examination of the Sherman, circling it repeatedly with the precision of a surgeon studying an unfamiliar patient. His initial observations filled him with cautious confidence. The armor was thin. He could already see that the vertical plates lacked the sophisticated slope that German doctrine had adopted from the Soviet T-34. The gun mounting appeared less refined than the Panthers. The overall construction seemed, to his experienced eye, crude and expedient. This was exactly what German propaganda had promised him: American manufacturing excellence, purchased at the cost of genuine engineering sophistication. American production could churn out thousands of these mediocre machines, while Germany crafted refined instruments of war. This understanding had sustained German military confidence through years of defeats. Surely, this captured specimen would confirm what German engineers already knew. He was wrong. The suspension system arrested his attention immediately. Where the Panther featured overlapping interleaved road wheels, an ingenious design that distributed weight across more contact points and reduced ground pressure, the Sherman used a radically different approach. The horizontal volute spring suspension, officially designated HVSS, arranged its road wheels in a simpler geometric pattern. The wheels hung from the hull on independent axles, connected by internal coil springs rather than the external leaf springs or more sophisticated suspension systems that German designers favored. At first glance, it appeared primitive, less elegant than the German solution. Hartmann noted this in his preliminary observations. But something about the system's simplicity gnawed at him. He requested that the testing team begin with a detailed mechanical examination before conducting any operational trials. The engineers arrived on November 14th, an assembly of technical specialists representing the highest achievement of German military industrial expertise. There was Wilhelm Steiner from Daimler-Benz, 58 years old, designer of final drive systems for German heavy tanks. There was Dr. Heinrich Vogel, a metallurgist who had spent the last 3 years analyzing American steel quality from captured equipment and bomb-damaged factories. There were transmission specialists, armor engineers, and junior officers, whose function was to record every detail for the technical analysis that would follow. The systematic disassembly began immediately. German engineers photographed every component. They measured tolerances with precision instruments. They analyzed material composition through metallurgical examination. They traced every connection, every bearing, every spring mechanism. The HVSS suspension came apart under their methodical investigation, piece by piece, revealing its internal logic. What emerged from the systematic analysis shocked every engineer in that team, though most would not admit it openly until years after the war. The HVSS suspension operated on fundamentally different engineering principles than German suspension designs. The Germans had pursued sophistication through complexity, overlapping wheels, intricate mechanical interconnections, and transmission of suspension forces through elaborate mechanical arrangements. This design philosophy reflected German engineering tradition, the assumption that more sophisticated solutions were inherently superior, that elegance and complexity demonstrated technical mastery. The HVSS represented an entirely different philosophy. Instead of distributing the tank's weight across overlapping wheels, the system used individual wheel arms, each acting independently. The wheels were arranged in a simpler pattern, 6 large road wheels, arranged in 3 axles per side. Each wheel rode on coil springs that compressed and extended independently of the other wheels. The system had no interconnections between wheels, no complex linkages, no mechanical sophistication whatsoever. It was, to German sensibilities, almost embarrassingly simple, and yet this is where the analysis became painful for the assembled German engineers. The simplicity created advantages that German designs could not match. Hartmann worked through the mathematics with Dr. Vogel. Each wheel on the HVSS operated as an independent suspension unit. When a wheel encountered an obstacle, a shell crater, a ridge of frozen earth, a log in muddy terrain, that wheel rose on its individual spring, while the other wheels maintained their position. The suspension spread the shock of the impact across all wheels, but no single wheel was forced to carry the impact load of the entire tank at once. By contrast, the Panther's interleaved suspension meant that when one outer wheel struck an obstacle, the mechanical connections transferred that shock through the elaborate suspension geometry to wheels on the opposite side of the tank. The impact loads were concentrated, not distributed. The entire suspension system had to absorb shocks that should have been localized. The result was accelerated wear on interconnected components, increased stress on drive mechanisms, and premature failure of suspension elements. The calculations were inescapable. The HVSS system distributed suspension stresses across 14 independent mounting points. The Panther's interleaved system concentrated those stresses through mechanical linkages that funneled impact loads toward critical connection points. The Americans had achieved something through simplicity that German engineering had failed to achieve through sophistication: optimal stress distribution under combat conditions. Wilhelm Steiner, the transmission specialist, made a further observation that morning. The independent suspension wheels meant that maintenance became dramatically simpler. A German mechanic changing an inner road wheel on a Panther had to first remove up to 8 outer wheels in an elaborate disassembly process that could consume an entire day. The Sherman required no such disassembly. Each road wheel was independently accessible. The process took perhaps 30 minutes with proper tools, or less than 2 hours under field conditions without specialized equipment. This simple maintenance advantage compounded across every aspect of field service. Broken road wheels could be replaced quickly. Bent axles could be swapped without dismantling the suspension system. Damaged springs could be replaced by a maintenance crew with basic mechanical skills. The sophistication that German engineers had pursued the interleaved wheels had created a maintenance burden that had crippled German armoured forces throughout 1944. Dr. Vogel focused his analysis on the materials. The coil springs used in the HVSS suspension were made of medium-grade steel, precisely calculated for the loads they would experience. The Americans had not used exotic alloys or sophisticated material science. They had simply calculated the exact stress each spring would experience under maximum operational conditions and specified a material with adequate strength margins and fatigue resistance for those calculated loads. The Panther's suspension components, by contrast, were made from higher-grade steel but were operating under stresses that exceeded their design parameters. The 45-ton combat weight of the Panther exceeded the design weight specifications that the suspension engineers had specified. This 28% weight overload meant that components designed for specific stresses were experiencing forces significantly higher than those for which they had been engineered. German metallurgical sophistication could not compensate for this fundamental design contradiction. The Sherman, at 30 tons, operated well within the design specifications of its suspension system. The Americans had designed the entire vehicle to work as an integrated system, with suspension designed for a specific weight, and that weight maintained through production discipline. The Germans had designed the Panther to be elegant, then added armor and firepower, and accepted the weight penalty rather than redesigning the suspension. The result was engineering failure masked by technical sophistication. By November 18th, Hartmann was preparing the preliminary report that would transform German understanding, or at least force a reckoning with the technical reality that German High Command had been denying. The HVSS suspension was not crude. It was precisely calibrated American pragmatism. It represented a different design philosophy, not an inferior one. It solved suspension problems through simplicity and calculated load distribution rather than through mechanical complexity. Hartmann wrote in his initial analysis, "The American suspension system achieves superior stress distribution through abandonment of European interconnection philosophy. The elimination of mechanical complexity reduces field maintenance burden by approximately 75% compared to contemporary German designs. The system sacrifices theoretical elegance for practical operational reliability." This was extraordinary language for a German engineer, an implicit admission that practical reliability might be preferable to theoretical elegance. But Hartmann had spent 40 years in engineering, and he understood the mathematics. The suspension did not lie. The numbers did not lie. Behind this technical analysis stood the human reality of men whose lives depended on suspension reliability. Consider the perspective of Gefreiter Johann Becker, a Panther commander who had fought through France and into Germany. Becker had experienced the mechanical fragility that sophisticated German suspension created. His tank's interleaved wheels had frozen in winter mud outside Aachen. The suspension had been locked by ice accumulated between the overlapping wheels, and it had taken 6 hours of work, chipping away ice with axes and entrenching tools before the tank could move again. During those 6 hours, his crew was immobilized, while American artillery observers were certainly adjusting fire on their position. On another occasion, a bent inner road wheel on Becker's Panther had required removal of 8 outer wheels in a process that consumed an entire day. The tank was unavailable for combat during that time. A Sherman in the American line, facing a similar problem, would have been combat-ready after 90 minutes of maintenance work. Becker and thousands of other Panther commanders understood viscerally what the engineers would soon admit in technical language. German sophistication was killing them. The reliability advantage of American pragmatism was measured not in technical papers, but in the lives of tank crews who died when mechanical failure prevented escape from disabled vehicles under fire. Consider the perspective of Lieutenant Friedrich Kern, a maintenance officer with 10th Panzer Division. Kern had spent the last 3 months trying to keep Panthers operational with inadequate spare parts, minimal skilled labor, and maintenance procedures so complex that they consumed resources faster than replacements could arrive. He knew the statistics without needing German technical reports to confirm them. A Sherman battalion could achieve 75% availability under combat conditions. His Panther company achieved 38%. The difference between 38% and 75% meant that while his nominal strength was 36 Panthers, only 14 were actually available for combat on any given day. The remaining 22 were undergoing maintenance, awaiting spare parts, or disabled in forward areas, waiting for recovery teams that were so overwhelmed with work that recovery operations took weeks. The American equivalent, a Sherman company with nominal strength 36, could expect approximately 27 tanks available for combat. This availability differential meant that an American armored company could sustain 3 times the combat power of a German Panther company despite equal nominal strength. American doctrine could plan offensive operations around this reliability. German doctrine had to plan defensively, accepting that lost initiative was the price of mechanical fragility. Kern had recently submitted a maintenance status report that had made its way to divisional headquarters and then to corps level. The report documented that maintaining 10 Panthers required more maintenance personnel, more spare parts logistics, more mobile workshop capability, and consumed more fuel than maintaining 30 Shermans. The mathematics were destroying German offensive capability, even when the Panther won individual tactical engagements. By November 22nd, the full testing report was nearing completion. Hartmann had directed comprehensive operational trials that would have shocked the assembled engineers if they had not already absorbed the implications of the suspension analysis. The Sherman was subjected to cross-country movement tests that replicated the conditions that had crippled Panthers throughout the war. The vehicle was driven through muddy terrain, over logs, across frozen ground, and through shell crater fields. Mud accumulated on the Panther's interleaved wheels. On the Sherman, mud fell away, naturally from the independent wheels. The accumulation problem that had immobilized Panthers in winter simply did not occur with the HVSS system. The Sherman was subjected to high-speed movement tests that stressed suspension systems. The independent suspension wheels absorbed shocks that would have been transmitted through the mechanical interconnections of the Panther suspension. Suspension wear measurements showed 40% less stress on critical components compared to projected stress patterns on equivalent Panther components operating under identical conditions. The Sherman was subjected to maintenance trials. A damaged road wheel could be replaced in 37 minutes by trained German mechanics. The same procedure on a Panther would have required removal of 8 other wheels and consumption of nearly an entire working day. The maintenance advantage was not theoretical speculation. It was demonstrated repeatedly across multiple vehicles and multiple maintenance scenarios. The testing also revealed something else. The Americans had designed the Sherman's HVSS suspension with adequate strength margins. The system was built slightly more robust than minimum specifications would require. The Germans, by contrast, had designed the Panther's suspension to minimum specifications to reduce weight, and then exceeded those specifications with a 45-ton combat weight. American conservatism had created reliability. German optimization had created fragility. Most damaging to German confidence was the realization that the Sherman's approach could not be easily copied. German engineers could not simply adopt HVSS suspension technology on existing Panther designs, because doing so would require redesigning the entire mechanical system that connected suspension to transmission and engine. The Panther had been designed with sophistication as the foundational principle. The Sherman had been designed with reliability and field maintenance as the foundational principles. These were not interchangeable philosophies. The entire vehicle had to be reconceived to implement American suspension concepts. By late November, Hartmann knew that German military decision-makers would face a painful choice. They could accept the technical reality that American suspension design was superior for combat conditions, which meant accepting that years of German engineering doctrine had been wrong, or they could suppress the analysis and continue believing that German sophistication would ultimately prevail, even though the evidence contradicted this belief. The preliminary report was forwarded to OKW German Army High Command on November 28, 1944. The analysis was thorough, mathematically rigorous, and inescapable in its conclusions. The HVSS suspension represented a design philosophy superior to German approaches for the operational conditions that existed in 1944 and 1945. The response from Berlin came slowly. There was no directive to implement HVSS equivalent designs. There was no acknowledgement of the technical superiority of American suspension philosophy. Instead, there was silence, the silence of military bureaucracy confronted with information that contradicted established doctrine and required decisions that were politically and militarily unpalatable. The Panther continued in production. The Panthers, already in service, continued to suffer mechanical failures that American technical analysis had accurately predicted. German crews continued to experience operational paralysis that originated in suspension reliability problems that could not be quickly solved. And the German engineers who had tested the captured Sherman and reached conclusions they could not publicly articulate knew that their technical analysis had revealed a truth that their military establishment would not act upon until it was too late to matter. Hartmann would survive the war. After 1945, he would work for Allied reconstruction efforts and eventually publish technical papers on armored vehicle design. He would never explicitly state what he had concluded during the Grafenwoehr tests, but engineers who worked with him in post-war years understood that his entire approach to vehicle design, emphasizing reliability, field maintenance, and practical operational reality over theoretical sophistication, traced back to what he had learned from the captured Sherman's HVSS suspension. Wilhelm Steiner did not survive. He was killed in a bombing raid on Stuttgart in March 1945, 5 months after testing the captured Sherman. His widow received notification of his death with no explanation of the technical work he had been conducting. The analysis he had contributed to the suspension evaluation was filed away in German archives, some of which would be recovered by Allied forces and analyzed by American engineers who would find their own assumptions about German technical superiority thoroughly validated by German engineers' own. Technical analysis. Lieutenant Kern survived the war, though his Panther company was destroyed in the final offensive into Germany. After the war, he became a technical advisor to the newly created German army, the Bundeswehr, helping to establish maintenance and logistics doctrine. The lessons he had learned about the catastrophic costs of mechanical complexity would shape German military planning for the next 50 years. When the Bundeswehr adopted American tanks during the 1,960 seconds, including derivatives of the Sherman suspension philosophy, Kern understood that German military procurement was finally accepting what the captured Sherman had demonstrated. Practical reliability defeats theoretical sophistication in industrial warfare. Gefreiter Becker spent 18 months in American captivity after the war. He eventually returned to civilian life in Bavaria and worked as a heavy equipment mechanic. When he encountered American-designed equipment decades later, he recognized the same design philosophy that had proven superior in the captured Sherman: simplicity, reliability, and practical maintenance accessibility. He never spoke publicly about his war experiences, but his children remembered him saying, "The Americans understood something we did not. They built machines for the world as it is, not the world as we wished it to be." The systematic testing of the captured M4A3E8 Sherman at Grafenwoehr revealed a fundamental contradiction in German military engineering. The Germans had pursued technical sophistication as an end in itself, creating complex systems that impressed other engineers and demonstrated German technical mastery. The Americans had pursued practical reliability as their end, creating simpler systems that prioritized field maintenance and operational sustainability. In 1944, with Germany's industrial capacity shrinking, fuel supplies collapsing, and trained maintenance personnel increasingly scarce, practical reliability mattered far more than technical sophistication. The HVSS suspension was not the most elegant solution to suspension engineering. It was the solution best suited to the actual operational conditions that tanks faced in November 1944. That was what made it superior. The German engineers who tested the captured Sherman could not change this reality through denial or suppression of analysis. They could only document it and watch as their military establishment continued committing resources to vehicles that had been fundamentally wrong for the conditions they faced since 1943. The Panther had been designed for a war of rapid mobile exploitation across open terrain. The war Germany was actually fighting in 1944, and 1945 was a war of attrition, defense against numerically superior forces, and slow retreat. The Panthers' sophisticated design made them increasingly irrelevant to the war that was actually being fought. And yet, because German military culture could not readily accept that American pragmatism had produced a superior solution, that analysis gathered dust in archives while German Panthers continued breaking down at rates that American intelligence agents could predict with mathematical precision. The story of the captured Sherman's HVSS suspension is not ultimately a story about engineering. It is a story about how organizations committed to particular ways of thinking, even when confronted with evidence that those ways of thinking are producing inferior results, and continue committing to those ways of thinking, because changing would require admitting fundamental error. The Sherman's HVSS suspension beat the Panther's interleaved system not because American engineers were inherently superior, but because they had been designed for the actual requirements of industrial warfare, while German systems had been designed for theoretical ideals. When German engineers were finally forced to confront this reality through systematic testing of captured equipment, they produced rigorous technical analysis proving American superiority, and then watched as that analysis was ignored because German military and political leadership could not afford to admit that German doctrine had been fundamentally wrong. This is the profound historical irony that the captured Sherman revealed. Sometimes the most advanced engineering is the simplest engineering, and sometimes the greatest technical achievement is having the wisdom to pursue adequacy rather than perfection. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The full technical analysis reached the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht on December 3, 1944. Oberführer Hartmann had produced a 47-page technical document accompanied by engineering drawings, metallurgical analysis, stress calculations, and photographic evidence. The report was formatted in the precise German military style. Conclusions stated directly, evidence presented systematically, and recommendations offered without ambiguity. For any organization genuinely committed to technical excellence, the report should have triggered an immediate strategic reassessment. The Wehrmacht was not such an organization. By December 1944, the institution was experiencing catastrophic institutional failure at every level. The Ardennes offensive had launched 3 days before the report arrived, a desperate gamble that consumed irreplaceable resources in pursuit of objectives that German military planners knew were unattainable, but that political leadership had ordered regardless. The failure of the Ardennes offensive was already becoming visible within days of its launch. Fuel shortages that commanders had predicted materialized exactly as the technical analyses had forecast. Panthers that were supposed to lead the breakthrough broke down at rates that nobody in the lower ranks would have described as anything other than predictable disaster. The captured Sherman analysis arrived into an institutional environment that was experiencing simultaneous military collapse and political instability. Hitler's response to military setbacks was not strategic reassessment but intensification of commitment to existing strategies, combined with purges of military leadership that expressed doubt. Officers who questioned German equipment reliability, who suggested that American tanks might have advantages worth studying, risked career consequences or worse. Hartmann understood this reality. He had submitted the technical analysis because it was his professional responsibility. He knew that the analysis would be shelved because it was his understanding of how military institutions respond to information that contradicts established doctrine in wartime. The response from Berlin came not from Field Command, but from the Reichsministerium für Rüstung und Kriegsproduktion, the Reich Ministry for Armaments and War Production. The ministry acknowledged receipt of the analysis with bureaucratic correctness, but offered no guidance about potential applications. The implication was clear. The analysis should be filed and forgotten. The Panther production program would continue. German doctrine would not change. The captured Sherman and the technical insights it represented would become an embarrassment that official German military channels would prefer to suppress rather than confront. However, the analysis had achieved limited distribution within German technical circles before institutional pressure suppressed wider discussion. Junior officers and engineers at Grafenwoehr, who had participated in the testing, understood the implications. Engineers at MAN and Daimler-Benz, who received copies through technical networks, recognized what the analysis demonstrated. Maintenance officers in armored divisions who were struggling with Panther reliability understood that the report validated what their experience was already teaching them. The knowledge was distributed through the German military technical establishment, even as official channels pretended it did not exist. While German headquarters suppressed discussion of the captured Sherman analysis, the Eastern Front was providing brutal real-world confirmation of everything the technical report had concluded. The Red Army had launched Operation Bagration in June 1944, and by December, that operation and its follow-on campaigns had destroyed German Army Group Center, killed or captured approximately 400,000 German soldiers, and liberated Belarus entirely from German occupation. The surviving elements of German armored formations were in catastrophic disarray, retreating through terrain conditions that exposed every mechanical weakness of the Panther. Obergefreiter Ernst Schulze was a maintenance sergeant with 24th Panzer Division in mid-December 1944, attempting to shepherd a company of 12 Panthers through the winter retreat from East Prussia. The temperature was dropping below -20 degrees Celsius at night. The roads were covered with packed snow and ice. The cross-country terrain was a combination of frozen mud, pine forests, and terrain that became impassable for conventional vehicles during winter conditions. Schulze's platoon of mechanics, 7 men who had been together since North Africa, were attempting the impossible, keeping mechanically fragile Panthers operational under conditions that guaranteed failure. The overlapping interleaved wheels of the Panther suspension accumulated packed snow and ice between the wheels overnight. Each morning, the suspension was immobilized by frozen residue. The process of clearing the suspension sufficiently to move the tank consumed 2 to 4 hours per vehicle, depending on conditions and the amount of ice accumulation. Once movement began, the process would repeat the following morning. One Panther in Schulze's company developed a crack in an inner road wheel on December 15th. The diagnosis was straightforward. The repair was theoretically simple. Replace the damaged wheel. The execution was catastrophic. Schulze's mechanics began the standard procedure. Remove 8 outer wheels. Access the damaged inner wheel. Remove it. Install the replacement. And reassemble the entire system. The procedure consumed 17 hours of continuous work in sub-zero temperatures with frozen equipment and men so cold they could barely work wrenches effectively. While that single tank was immobilized for replacement of 1 wheel, the company's operational strength dropped from 11 to 10 tanks. By December 17th, when the repair was finally completed, 2 additional Panthers had developed mechanical problems serious enough to render them immobile. The company's available strength had dropped to 9 operational tanks. The nominal company strength was 12. Schulze understood the mathematics without needing German technical analysis to confirm them. The Sherman maintenance procedures he had observed from German prisoners and captured American documents would have restored that tank to operational status within 90 minutes using the independent suspension design. The German procedure had required 17 hours. And 2 additional mechanical failures had occurred during the maintenance process. The operational implications were not theoretical. On December 18th, a Soviet tank attack struck the defensive position that Schulze's Panthers were supposed to defend. Only 9 Panthers were operational. The Soviet attack broke through, and the German defensive line collapsed. The numerical disadvantage defending with 9 tanks where 12 were theoretically available meant that no defensive line could be maintained. Soviet forces inflicted substantial casualties on the German division and forced a chaotic retreat. Schulze survived. He would spend the remainder of the war attempting to maintain Panther companies that were gradually reduced by combat losses, mechanical failures, and abandonment of vehicles that could not be recovered. By the final weeks of the war, Schulze's original company of 12 Panthers had been reduced to a single operational vehicle that Schulze himself maintained. That final Panther was destroyed when Soviet forces overran the position. Schulze was captured and spent 2 years as a Soviet prisoner of war before repatriation in 1947. While Schulze was struggling with frozen suspension wheels in East Prussia, American armored formations operating in the Ardennes were experiencing dramatically different maintenance realities. The American 3rd Armored Division, equipped primarily with M4A3 Shermans, many fitted with the newer HVSS suspension that German engineers had just analyzed, was operating in conditions that were, if anything, more severe than those facing German forces. The Ardennes winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest on record. The terrain was challenging. The operational tempo was intense. American logistics were stretched thin by the rapid advance into German territory. Yet the operational availability rates that 3rd Armored Division reported at the end of December 1944 showed 78% of authorized tank strength operational at any given moment. This achievement in the most severe winter conditions and under sustained operational tempo vindicated every technical principle that the Sherman's HVSS suspension embodied. The comparison was devastating to German military planning. An American armored division with fewer nominal tanks achieved greater operational availability than a German panzer division equipped with allegedly superior equipment. The theoretical advantages of the Panther existed on paper and in individual tank engagements. The practical advantages of the Sherman existed on the road, in maintenance areas, and in the cumulative availability of operational tanks for sustained military operations. The disparity in maintenance requirements told a story that extended far beyond suspensions. American armored divisions that had suffered substantial combat losses in the Ardennes received replacement tanks at rates of 50 to 100 vehicles per week. German panzer divisions that had suffered comparable losses received 0 to 15 replacement tanks per week, frequently receiving no replacements at all in weeks when production could not meet frontline demands. American crews knew that destroyed tanks would be replaced. German crews knew their Panthers were irreplaceable. This disparity in replacement rates produced psychological differences that shaped tactical behavior. American tank commanders approached combat, knowing that if their tank was destroyed, they would be transferred to a replacement vehicle and continue fighting within a week. This knowledge encouraged aggressive tactics and reduced hesitation to take calculated risks. German Panther commanders approached combat, knowing that if their tank was destroyed or disabled, the crew faced either death in combat, capture by Soviet forces, or, if they escaped capture, integration into replacement crews that might receive a replacement tank weeks or months in the future if one became available at all. The psychological toll of operating unreliable equipment became more severe as the war progressed. German Panther crews in early 1945 had developed a specific pattern of behavior that maintenance officers recognized and documented in surviving unit records. Rather than pushing Panthers forward aggressively, commanders habitually held tanks in reserve positions to preserve them for defensive operations. Rather than conducting reconnaissance missions in Panthers, commanders insisted on sending lightly armored reconnaissance vehicles instead, reserving the precious Panthers for defensive positions where reliability mattered less than protection. This tactical caution surrendered initiative to the Soviets and Americans precisely when German forces most needed to regain initiative. The mechanical fragility of the Panther had transformed from a logistical problem into a tactical problem, into a strategic problem. German operations were shaped not by strategic plans or by tactical requirements, but by the mechanical limitations of the equipment that doctrine required German forces to rely upon. In Berlin, the suppression of the Grafenwoehr analysis had begun almost immediately after its arrival. The ministry did not order Hartmann to retract his findings or to reconsider his conclusions. Instead, official channels ceased discussion of the analysis. New officers assigned to technical positions were not briefed on the captured Sherman evaluation. The findings were compartmentalized within the technical establishment, discussed only among engineers who already understood the implications and were powerless to change German procurement policy. The suppression served an institutional function. German military leadership was already experiencing cognitive time dissonance between the technological superiority they believed German military equipment possessed and the operational failures that equipment was producing. The propaganda apparatus had built the entire German military mystique on claims of technological superiority. Admitting that American suspension design was superior would undermine that propaganda simultaneously at home and throughout the occupied territories. It would demoralize German personnel. It would raise questions about the wisdom of German military planning. So the analysis was suppressed, not through any formal order but through institutional silence that communicated clearly to everyone involved that discussion of the topic was undesirable. Hartmann himself received no further assignments related to tank design or armored vehicle development. Instead, he was transferred to administrative duties at a facility responsible for training replacement vehicle operators. The transfer was not presented as punishment, but was understood by everyone as precisely that. The message was clear. Technical analysis that contradicted established doctrine was not valued, regardless of its accuracy or rigor. Wilhelm Steiner, the transmission specialist, had already been killed in the bombing raid on Stuttgart before the suppression began in earnest. His widow never knew that her husband's final technical work had proven American superiority in suspension design. The knowledge died with him. Dr. Heinrich Vogel, the metallurgist, survived the war but never returned to working on armored vehicle design. He became a university professor, teaching materials science to engineering students. In his later years, after Germany was divided and reunified, Vogel would occasionally reference the Grafenwoehr testing in lectures, describing it to students as an example of how rigorous technical analysis sometimes reveals uncomfortable truths that institutions are not prepared to accept. He never provided details about the analysis itself. The secrecy of wartime technical work remained embedded in his consciousness, even decades after the war's conclusion. But his students understood the broader lesson about the relationship between knowledge and institutional response. By early 1945, the mechanical unreliability of German armoured forces had become so severe that it was constraining German military operations across all fronts. The February 1945 operation to eliminate the Soviet bridgehead west of the Vistula River, Operation Konrad, was planned as a coordinated use of multiple panzer divisions to achieve breakthrough. The operation failed, not from Soviet tactical skill or numerical superiority in the immediate engagement area, but from mechanical failures that reduced German operational strength by approximately 40% during the first 48 hours of the offensive. German official reports on Operation Konrad cited fuel shortages, Soviet anti-tank defenses, and tactical miscalculations as factors in the failure. The reports did not mention that Panther mechanical failures had reduced operational strength from 189 tanks at operation launch to 112 tanks by the end of the first day. Nor did the reports mention that maintenance personnel were so overwhelmed by the volume of mechanical failures that they were unable to evacuate disabled tanks to repair facilities faster than they were being abandoned or destroyed in forward areas. A confidential report from the operational commander to OKW on February 10, 1945, included the statement, "Operational losses from enemy action, 47 tanks. Operational losses from mechanical failure, 30 tanks. Additional tanks disabled and abandoned due to inability to recover under tactical conditions, 23 tanks. Effective tank strength reduction, 100 tanks from initial 189. This mathematical reality was documented and forwarded through German military channels, but the underlying cause, the mechanical inadequacy of German armoured vehicles, remained officially unexamined, because examining it would require accepting that German procurement decisions had been fundamentally wrong. Lieutenant Friedrich Kern, the maintenance officer from 10th Panzer Division, survived Operation Conrad and was reassigned to the newly activated 21st Panzer Division in late February 1945. His new assignment placed him in responsibility for maintenance operations for a company of 36 Panthers, preparing for defensive operations in the Rhineland. He estimated that he could achieve 42% availability with his current personnel and logistical resources. The division commander's operational plan assumed 80% availability. Kern submitted a written report to division headquarters, documenting that the operational plan was unrealistic given the mechanical condition of the available equipment and the available maintenance resources. His report was reviewed, acknowledged, and rejected. The division commander had received orders from Corps headquarters to maintain aggressive defensive operations. Corps headquarters had received orders from Army Group headquarters to maintain strength regardless of mechanical limitations. The orders came from Berlin. The orders came from Hitler. The orders did not acknowledge that German equipment could not sustain the operational tempo being demanded. Kern did the best he could with what he had. During the Rhineland defensive operations of late February and early March 1945, his maintenance teams worked 18-hour days, attempting to keep Panthers operational. The availability rate improved to 47% better than his initial estimates, but far short of the 80% assumption that operational plans were built on. The disparity between available strength and assumed strength meant that German defensive lines were weaker than their commanders believed, creating tactical vulnerabilities that Soviet and American commanders would exploit. By April 1945, the German military technical establishment had developed substantial unofficial knowledge about American equipment superiority in several categories. The captured Sherman analysis was known within technical circles. Similar analyses of other American equipment, trucks, artillery, small arms, ammunition, explosives had reached similar conclusions about American pragmatism, producing reliable equipment, and German perfectionism producing fragile equipment. The knowledge remained compartmentalized, suppressed, and officially unacknowledged. German military planners continued building operational plans on theoretical assumptions about equipment superiority that technical analysis had proven were incorrect. German forces continued operating as if German equipment was adequate for the operational tempos being demanded, even though maintenance officers at every level knew that equipment was failing to meet those demands. This represented the most profound failure in German military-industrial organization. Not the failure to design good equipment, but the failure to allow technical knowledge to influence operational planning and strategic decision-making. German engineers had been rigorous enough to conduct technical analysis that revealed uncomfortable truths. German organizations were not mature enough to act on those truths. Consider the perspective of Captain Hans Müller, the commander of the armored reconnaissance platoon that First Army was attempting to maintain in early 1945. Müller had been a professional officer for 20 years. He had commanded vehicles and formations across multiple theaters. By April 1945, he understood viscerally what German military planners would not officially acknowledge. German equipment was mechanically inferior to American equipment under the operational conditions that actually existed. Müller had observed American replacement procedures during interrogation of captured American tank crews and from reading captured American unit reports that had been recovered during the retreat. American maintenance doctrine emphasized rapid replacement of defective components using spare parts stocks that were maintained at multiple levels. American tank crews expected to return to maintenance areas for repairs and know that they would receive a replacement vehicle within days if their original vehicle was not repairable. German maintenance doctrine emphasized field repair with minimal parts redundancy, creating situations where disabled vehicles could be immobilized for weeks, waiting for repairs that could not be completed from available resources. The difference was not philosophical posturing. It was the difference between an army that could sustain sustained operations and an army that could not. American forces had won the Normandy breakout not because they had better tactics, but because they could sustain operational tempos that German forces could not match. American forces had won in the Ardennes not because they had superior strategy, but because their equipment could recover from the intense operational demands of the campaign faster than German equipment could. Müller knew this. Every maintenance officer in German forces knew this. But the knowledge remained unofficial, unacknowledged, and powerless to influence operational planning. German First Army received orders to maintain mobile operations in retreat toward the Rhine. The orders assumed equipment reliability that German forces did not possess. Müller's vehicles broke down at rates that ensured that the mobile operations would degenerate into defensive chaos within 48 hours. On April 8, 1945, Müller's reconnaissance platoon was destroyed when Soviet forces overran their position. Müller was killed in the engagement. He never learned that technical analysis conducted months earlier at Grafenwoehr had documented the equipment reliability problems that had destroyed his platoon. The collapse of German military forces in April and May 1945 was overdetermined. The outcome was inevitable from multiple directions. Soviet forces possessed numerical superiority. American forces possessed industrial capacity that exceeded German capacity by an order of magnitude. German forces were fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with unlimited replacement resources. The conclusion was predetermined. Yet the contribution of mechanical equipment, failure to this predetermined collapse, is substantial and underestimated in most historical accounts. German forces were unable to sustain the operational tempos required for successful defense because their equipment could not be maintained at the availability rates required for sustained operations. American forces conducted operations at tempos that German forces could not match, not primarily because American commanders were superior, but because American equipment could sustain those tempos. The German forces that could have been fielded, with 9,000 reliable Panzer IV tanks instead of 6,000 temperamental Panthers, would still have been defeated. The numerical and industrial disparity was too great. But the specific manner of that defeat, the operational possibilities available to German commanders, and the length of time required to achieve that defeat were all influenced by the mechanical adequacy of German equipment. The captured Sherman analysis had documented this reality in technical precision by December 1944. German military decision-makers chose not to act on that analysis. That choice did not change the underlying reality, but it did ensure that German forces would continue operating under false assumptions about their equipment's capabilities, guaranteeing tactical decisions based on faulty premises. German military forces surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The Wehrmacht ceased to exist as an organized military entity. The analysis of the captured Sherman was filed away in German military archives, some of which were captured by Allied forces, and some of which disappeared into Soviet archives. After the war, German engineers participated in Allied reconstruction efforts and in the technical investigations that American and British military organizations were conducting into the lessons of World War II. Hartmann was recruited by the American occupation authorities to work on vehicle design and maintenance procedures for the new German state. The principles he had learned from the captured Sherman analysis, emphasis on reliability, focus on field maintenance, accessibility, and pragmatic design for actual operational conditions rather than theoretical ideals, became the foundation of his post-war technical work. Kern survived the war and became a technical advisor to the newly formed Bundeswehr. When German forces began receiving American equipment in the 1952, including tanks derived from Sherman design principles, Kern understood that German military organization was finally accepting what technical analysis had proven in 1944. Maintenance, accessibility, and reliability mattered more than theoretical technical sophistication. The institutional lesson that the German military learned through defeat was not learned willingly. It was imposed by the reality that German forces had experienced. But the lesson was thorough. When West Germany participated in NATO and received American military equipment, the doctrine that governed the maintenance and deployment of that equipment was based on principles proven valid by Sherman operations in World War II. Reliable equipment sustained through pragmatic maintenance procedures beats sophisticated equipment that cannot be maintained in field conditions. Schulze, who had struggled with frozen Panther suspensions in East Prussia, survived Soviet captivity and returned to Bavaria in 1947. He became a heavy equipment operator for a construction company, working on American-made equipment for the post-war reconstruction effort. He recognized in that equipment the same design philosophy he had observed in the captured Sherman: simplicity, reliability, and practical field maintenance. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experience, but colleagues remembered him saying that the Americans understood something about how to build machines for use rather than machines for admiration. The captured M4A3E8 Sherman, with its HVSS suspension, represented a profound paradox that extended far beyond the specific technical question of suspension design. German engineers had produced technical analysis that was rigorous, accurate, and that reached conclusions validated by subsequent history. That analysis was generated by the most sophisticated military technical establishment in Europe at that time. Yet the analysis was suppressed and ignored because German military and political organization was not capable of acting on accurate technical knowledge when that knowledge contradicted established doctrine. The Sherman beat the Panther not because American suspension design was more elegant, but because it was more practical. The HVSS suspension distributed loads across independent wheels, simplifying maintenance and reducing stress on critical components. This practical design philosophy was echoed throughout the Sherman: air-cooled engines that required minimal maintenance compared to complex liquid-cooled engines, independent transmission that could be replaced quickly, armament that was adequate rather than theoretically perfect, and armor that was sufficient for operational requirements rather than optimized for theoretical penetration resistance. The American design philosophy prioritized what worked reliably under the actual conditions of industrial warfare: sustained operations over months, rapid maintenance of damaged equipment, replacement of components by minimally trained personnel using field conditions, and production of sufficient quantities to sustain operations regardless loss rates. This philosophy was not born from superior intellect, but from different historical experience and different industrial constraints that American military planning had developed. German design philosophy prioritized what was theoretically superior: maximum performance, perfect integration of components, optimization of every parameter, and production of equipment adequate to support idealized operational scenarios. This philosophy was not inferior in theoretical merit, but was inadequate for the practical requirements of the war that Germany was actually fighting by 1943. The tragedy of the captured Sherman analysis is not that it revealed German technical inferiority. German engineers were as capable as any technical establishment in the world. The tragedy is that German military organization lacked the institutional flexibility to accept accurate technical analysis when that analysis contradicted established beliefs, and lacked the strategic wisdom to adapt operational plans to reflect technical reality. The analysis documented that American suspension design was superior for the operational conditions that existed in 1944 and 1945. This analysis was accepted by the engineers who conducted it. The analysis was distributed through German technical channels. The analysis influenced a limited circle of technical professionals who understood its implications. And yet German military decision-makers, the generals, the ministry officials, the military planners, chose to suppress and ignore the analysis rather than allow it to influence strategic decisions. This choice was made in desperation, not arrogance. By December 1944, Germany's military situation was catastrophic. Admitting that American equipment was superior would have required fundamental reassessment of German military strategy at the moment when that strategy was already collapsing. German leadership was not psychologically or politically prepared for that reassessment, so the knowledge was suppressed, the analysis was filed away, and German forces continued operating on false assumptions about equipment reliability until the collapse became complete. The captured Sherman proved something that historians have debated ever since. Does superior technical understanding guarantee superior operational outcomes? The answer that the Grafenwoehr testing provides is not necessarily. German engineers understood their equipment better than American engineers understood theirs, in the sense that German technical analysis was more rigorous and more precise. Yet, American forces achieved superior operational outcomes because American equipment was designed for the operational conditions that actually existed, and because American military organization was prepared to accept that pragmatic adequacy defeats theoretical perfection. The Panther lost not because it was an inferior design, it was not. The Panther lost because it was designed for a war of mobile breakthrough and rapid exploitation, and Germany was fighting a war of attrition and defense. The Sherman won not because it was a superior design in any theoretical sense. American engineers understood that their design made compromises in armor and firepower that German engineers would not have accepted. The Sherman won because it was designed for the war that was actually being fought. The difference was not intellectual capacity but institutional wisdom, the capacity of an organization to accept accurate technical analysis and adapt to its implications. German organization possessed the former capacity but not the latter. American organization possessed both. In the competition between nations fighting total industrial war, organizational wisdom matters more than technical sophistication. The report from Grafenwoehr remains one of the war's most poignant historical documents. Technically rigorous analysis of inconvenient truth, conducted by men who understood exactly what their analysis meant, suppressed by institutions that could not afford to acknowledge those implications, and filed away in archives where it could be preserved, but not allowed to influence the decisions that mattered. The captured Sherman's HVSS suspension beat the Panthers' interleaved system in the only competition that ultimately matters in warfare: operational availability under sustained combat conditions. The Germans knew it by December 1944. They simply could not admit it until decades after the war had ended. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.